if you will allow me, I will just start with a small anecdote which I think may illustrate our conversation later, and then move on to the discussions of your books. Many millennia ago, when I was a student in Pakistan, I attended a school called the Convent of Jesus and Mary, and I was doing my A-levels. I was about 15 at my O-levels. I was about 15 at that time, and much to the consternation of the Irish nuns who ran the school, one of the topics which was introduced as a subject in our biology course that year was called human reproduction, not sexual reproduction, human reproduction. So they got this Pathan lady to come and teach us human reproduction, and she zipped through the course. She zipped through the topic in about, I think, an hour. And then just about 2 minutes before break, she said, "Any questions?" So there was this one intrepid girl, and she raised her hand. She said, Miss, if you have sex when you are having your period, do you get pregnant?" And she looked at her, and she fixed her with this gimlet stare, and she said, "Muslims don't behave that way."
And they don't have sex, or they don't menstruate? That's the question.
I think they don't menstruate, they don't have sex, they just don't behave that way at all. So, when I was reading your book and I found out all the ways in which Muslims do behave.
We have whole chapters in the history of Arabic erotica just on that subject. How to get it on during menstruation.
You must tell me the names of these books. But anyway, what prompted you to write these books? Sally, shall I?
I think I just sort of noticed that India was at a changing point. I travelled to India over many years, for around sort of 20 years since I was a backpacker. And in the sort of backpacking days, I've been subject to quite a lot of eve teasing, petty groping.
Lovely phrase, eve teasing.
Lovely phrase. It makes it seem so innocuous, doesn't it? Bit of sort of slap and tickle fun. But my favourite anecdote was a friend who was on a train, and she was sort of sitting there, going sort of, typical route, sort of south to go from Mumbai. And she was pulling out for Ratnagari station, the sun was coming up, it was sort of really beautiful sunlight, and she sort of looked out the window and saw a young man on a bicycle, thought, "Oh, hi," smiled at the young man, did a quick sort of second turn and saw that he was masturbating with one hand whilst cycling with the other. It was a real sort of, these sort of real kind of feats of endurance, actually. So it was this
and keeping pace with the moving train.
Keeping pace with the moving train. It's quite spectacular.
The future in Formula One for that.
Dexterity, amazing. But I think it was that I'd experienced this of India, but I'd also experienced this sort of transporting, the land of the Taj Mahal, this land that gave us sort of love and romance and all of these sort of ideas around sexuality, and of course the Kama Sutra, which I'm sure we'll go into later. So it was to try and reconcile these two things at a time when I propose in the book that a sexual revolution is taking place. So.
And Shereen, yourself?
So, as you know, I spent 5 years traveling across the Arab region, from Morocco right through to Egypt, and then from Saudi Arabia up through to Lebanon, talking to people about sex, so what they do, what they think, what they don't do, and why. And I know, depending on your perspective, this might sound like a dream job, or possibly a really dubious occupation. But for me, it came from my personal and professional background. So personally speaking, I am half Egyptian, I am Muslim, and most of my family live in the Arab region, but I grew up in the West, in Canada, very far from my Arab roots. And I didn't think much about my Arab heritage until September 11th, actually. And the terrible events of that day really impelled me to want to learn more about where I came from, really. The fact that I chose sex as my lens, I know, is a little unusual, but that comes from my professional background. I trained as an immunologist, and my first job at The Economist magazine was writing about global healthcare, and part of my job was reporting on the global HIV/AIDS epidemic. And I became interested in understanding what is happening around HIV in the Arab world. And if you want to know about HIV in the Arab region, you have to look at sex, because it's the main route of transmission. And as I started talking to people about sex within that sort of public health framework, it became clear to me that sex is this amazing lens through which to understand any society, because what's happening inside the bedroom is affected by forces on a bigger stage in terms of politics, economics, and religion and tradition. And as I argue in the book, this vice versa. What happens in intimate life also has repercussions on the bigger stage as well. And certainly within the context of Islam, the boundaries are there, halal and haram. But quite frankly, it's not all black and white, even at those what seemingly hard borders. There are at least 50 shades of gray when it comes to talking about sex in Islam. And it's true that if one looks back at the long history of writing about sexuality in Arabic, we have this extraordinarily rich history that really spans a millennium, from the time of the Prophet Muhammad really until the 19th century. I'm telling you, there is nothing in the joy of sex or Cosmopolitan or indeed 50 Shades of Grey that they were not writing about 1,000 years ago in Baghdad. Really quite amazing.
And India as well. You say that there's Kama Sutra, there's the
there's
Khajuraho temple.
There's a huge sort of rich and various history, and there's a sense of humour too. So in this sort of ancient sexuality, you have voyeuristic gods, you have this sort of beautiful kind of expression of open copulation. But then it's not all that it seems, because the Kama Sutra was written during the Gupta Empire as really a guide for the man about town or the rich man of the era, and how to sort of enjoy the lower orders in terms of sort of sexual fun. So it's not all as it seems, but even in the Kama Sutra, which was written for this market, you have this idea that women should enjoy sex, which is, really revolutionary to many kind of mindsets. And you have a sort of sense of play within sex. And then you have the sort of history of Tantra, which was permeated most, obviously, as we know, most religions for 700 years, that was about expressing the earthly. And it was about expressing the earthly rather than this idea that came before, that it was all about an illusion. We had to express the earthly, and part of that is, and if you've been to Khajuraho or any of the sort of erotic temples in India, you just see the sense of fun and you think, actually it's something that we in the West have lost.
This is a passage from a book called The Encyclopedia of Pleasure, which was written in 10th, 11th century Baghdad. And it tells the story of a woman living in Medina at the time of the birth of Islam. And she's called Hubba al-Madaniyya. Hubba al-Madaniyya, for instance, said that one day she went out of the bath accompanied by a boy who had a puppy. It so happened that the puppy, seeing her vulva and vaginal lips, went between her legs and began to lick her organ. She lowered her body to give the animal a better chance of performing its job. However, when she had reached an orgasm, she fell down heavily upon it and could not raise herself until the helpless animal had died from heavy pressure. Apologies to animal lovers in the audience.
Sally, please feel free to read something from your book too, if you'd like.
Yes, I mean, it's more of a photo in terms of the sort of sense of fun. Maybe I'll pass it around, actually. That might be a better thing to do. This is when I'm at Khajuraho, and we're walking around a corner of the temple. And if anyone's who's not been, it's all of these sort of parades of lusty friezes, of copulating gods, court maidens, animals, in flagrante, in this sort of gorgeous sort of spread of copulation. Ajay leads us to the jutting west corner of the temple, and then with a lightning grin exclaims, "Look, here's something showing what ancient Hindus can teach us about not taking sex and religion too seriously. It's Ganesh, the elephant god, wearing a broad smile. And what's he looking at? It's a trick of perspective. We round 90 degrees of the temple wall and see, behind Ganesh, a bald-headed Brahmin priest in flagrante with a court maiden, supplely doubled over, forehead to her knees. It becomes clear now that Ganesh is looking on, the self-congratulating voyeur. This playfulness would be unconscionable in the Judeo-Christian tradition, or in Islam, especially 21st century Islam, undergoing its painful spasms of change. And what I might do is pass around this picture of the Ganesh.
Can we start here?
Yeah.
Oh, good heavens.
Yeah.
So what brought about the change, do you think? What brought about the change from sex as a source of joy and pleasure and play to this sort of pent-up anger and rage about sex and this kind of frustration and declaring it haram, etc.?
I think the closing down around sex is part and parcel of a much sort of broader, longer historical process. This is the closing down in almost all domains across Arab societies. And what's interesting about the history of Arabic erotica is that it pretty well dries up around the 19th century. And it's not a coincidence that that's the time that many countries in the region are colonized by Europeans, and this comes back to the point they're raising, that if not laws that were imposed around sort of criminalizing unnatural practices, et cetera, certainly a spirit enters, particularly amongst the upper classes, which begins to question, have we fallen under the sway of Western powers because somehow we are what they say we are? We are debauched, we have deviated from the true way of Islam, the Sharia. And this becomes part of the discourse you hear in the birth of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1920s in Egypt. Part of the reason for today is the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the late 1970s, which has very much narrowed people's willingness to think openly about possibilities within Islam, about women, women's rights, the body of a woman, and around sex. At the end of the day, if you really want to control people, you take sex, you wrap it up in religion, and it is an extremely powerful tool of any authoritarian system, be it Islamic fundamentalist or indeed a secular dictatorship. And that is what we have seen playing out in Egypt and much of the Arab region over the last few decades.
The open kind of carnality of Hinduism was first at threat in the sort of 17th century with the sort of rise of a kind of post-Golden Age Islam and the repressions within that. And you found that a lot of the yogini goddess temples of the time that had these sort of, these wonderful kind of goddess era sort of statues had their breasts removed and their yonis removed. And then later on, this sort of Raj era crackdowns, the same sort of thing, the kind of colonial impulse that looked at India and saw all of these sort of succulent houris of the East, as one commentator said, and saw the eunuchs and saw the courtly dancers and all of these sort of sexually quite titillating to the sort of colonial eye, and thought, okay, we're going to crack down on this. And they did sort of legally. They, you know, there had been communities of eunuchs that had existed living in houses for thousands of years in these communities, and they were broken by the Raj in this sort of series of moralizing crackdowns. And then more recently, I think that all of these sort of ideas have been appropriated by a sort of conservative mood, a sort of conservative Hindu mood that's sort of taken on a lot of these values. But yes, it was a long-term campaign of breaking the sexual other by the British. That's the main route.
And what I find very interesting in interviewing people across the region is that they very often knew the score. They knew what sexual life was more or less in the Arab region, more or less outside in the West. But very often they are making different decisions, not out of ignorance, but based on information. And to give you the example of many, many gay activists I met in the Arab region, when I asked them, do you want the freedom to come out? And they would say, no, that's not the freedom we're looking for. We are looking for the freedom to stay in and have relations behind closed doors. So at the end of the day, people are aspiring to sexual freedom, but it's the freedom to make an individual informed choice. And I think the challenge for those in other parts of the world is to respect the fact that that choice may take very different forms than what you see in your own society.